Yeah, welcome everyone. So we're going to be talking tonight about Rhynie, and I was telling my students today that I was talking about public engagement and my previous experience of this, and I was recalling an event that about 20 years ago when we did our first ever survey at Rhynie. We decided to give a talk to the local village, and 3 people turned up. So it's great to see such a turnout today. So we'll be taking you a bit further back in time than 530 years tonight. So we're going to be looking at early medieval Scotland, or what would have traditionally been called the Dark Ages. And in this time period, there were a whole series of different identities within what became Scotland. So there were the Pictish kingdoms in the northeast, there were the Scots, or the Gaels, on the west, Britons down in the southwest, and Northumbrian Anglo-Saxons down in the southeast. So this was a real mixing pot of different identities, different language groups, etc. But probably the kind of traditionally the darkest of those kingdoms was the Picts. And that was due to a lack of historical sources, really. So we only have one native series of documents, and this is a series of king lists by the Picts themselves. Everything else is external sources, including things like the Irish Annals, which were the tweets of the day. Not allowed to call them anymore, am I? So there's some examples down on the right. So it tells us about, the death of a king of the Picts, or a major battle taking place. So just really little snippets, so tiny portions of information. Other than that, we have some external sources like Bede's History of the English Nation, or Athavan's Life of Columba, which recount events in Pictland. Other than that, we're kind of relying on things like carved stones, which the Picts are very famous for. This system of symbols that you find carved on stones. Very occasionally you get Latin inscriptions on stones. And we have things like place names, which can also tell us a little bit about this time period. And they tell us that this was a kingdom-based society. These are the first documented kingdoms in northern Britain. They refer to particular sites of power, and these tend to be hill forts when we can identify them. And they refer to things like battles or sieges at these places. But in general, all our sources are 7th century or later, so it's really hard to piece together that earlier history of the Picts, which goes back to the late Roman period. And this is the first mention of the Picts, which is in a Roman source, talking about this feared enemy of Rome, and back projecting that identity to the time of Caesar. And so this seems to be a Roman coining for a group of people living north of the frontier who are causing havoc at that frontier in terms of warfare and attacks on Roman Britain. And what seems to happen during the later Roman period is that there's some sort of consolidation of the groups. So in our early Roman sources, we have lots of tribal identities mentioned or referenced on things like Ptolemy's map. But by the time we get to the 4th century, we only have reference to the Picts and a few other societies. So as is common in many of these frontiers, in face of an empire, there seems to be consolidation of groups in order to resist. Now, in a post-Roman period, we still have very few sources. So we know that in Pictland itself, there were different areas, places like Cay or Fortrue, which seems to be in the overkingship from the 7th century. But again, we have very little detail. Now, I'm an archaeologist, I'm not a historian, so obviously when I was starting to think about a Pictish project, I went back to one of the famous sources for Pictish history and archaeology, and this was a book written by Wainwright in 1955, where he brought together all the evidence for the Picts, place names, all sorts of things. And this is what he said about archaeology. There's no problem, no Pictish problem in archaeology because archaeology knows nothing of the Picts. So that was a kind of call to arms, I guess, for our project. And he was right in many ways. It's gotten slightly better in recent decades, but it's still quite slim pickings. So we have one or two sites like this one, Dundurn down in Perthshire, which is mentioned as being under siege in AD 683. And there's been some very small-scale archaeology here, but not a huge amount. We have, literally a handful of Pictish settlement sites down in the lowlands. There's more in uplands, like this Byre House found in upland Perthshire. And very few burials as well. There's only a few cemeteries where we actually have individuals that we can identify as Picts, and very few dates from these kinds of cemeteries. So this is where our project came in. So it was established in 2012 as the Northern Picts Project, funded by various donations to the department, and then by the Leverhulme Trust from 2017 to this year. And we began to really put a lot of dots on the map. So this is what Pictland looked like pre the year 2000. So all the blue dots are the famous Pictish stones, and there were literally 8 known archaeological sites, which were in the yellow dots. And then it's probably our picture today. You can see there's a lot more sites being put on the map, and that was due to lots of kind of small-scale excavations with some larger set-piece landscape scale studies. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, Rhynie, which was really our formative project. So this is a picture of what inspired the Rhynie project. So in 1978, Kevin Alston was ploughing his field with his father, and he hit this big stone, and lo and behold, when they turned it over, this figure was carved on the stone, the so-called Rhynie man. So what on earth was this figure doing in a field just to the south of the village of Rhynie? Well, it was one of many stones found around Rhynie over about a century and a half. Basically, whenever the farmer got a new plough, they would hit a new stone. And so Rhynie man is one of 8 of these monuments, carrying his axe here. But there's also a carving of a warrior. He's quite degraded now, but you can maybe just see he's carrying a spear and a square shield. There's also lost monuments. This one was recorded in the 19th century, but we don't know where it is today. And then what was exciting for us as archaeologists was that one of these stones still seemed to stand in its original position. And this is the crossstane carved with this salmon and this Pictish beast here. And then in the background you can see Noth. And the same year that Rhynie man was found, archaeologists from Aberdeenshire Council Archaeology Service flew over the site and found this series of crop mark enclosures which indicated some sort of buried site under the ground. And Rhynie man came from just a few meters downslope from that site and a few meters away from the crossstane. And the other thing that excited us about the site was the place name. And this refers to an early Celtic word, ri, for king. So it means a place associated with a great king. And indeed, that's what we seem to have found during our excavations at Rhynie. So our very first excavation was in 2011. We'd only set up the Department of Archaeology in 2007, so this was one of our first big projects. And so this is an illustration of what we found underneath the ground and a plot of those crop marks from the air. And essentially what we found was a very, very high status settlement dating to the Pictish period from the 4th to the early 6th century AD. And this gives you an idea of the kind of trenches where we're digging. Very large excavations, revealing here parts of the ditches that enclosed the early phase of this settlement. So this was essentially a defended settlement on a little glacial knoll with very high status activities and buildings inside. And then later on, it was enclosed by this really elaborate timber enclosure. This is the kind of palisade slot, and you can see all the ghosts of the timbers, and that's how we work out what these things would have actually looked like. And then inside, there were a series of buildings, big rectangular and subcircular buildings, which is really unusual for the Pictish period. And then we even think we found the actual place where the Rhynie man once stood. So right next to the crossdame, we found a stone socket, and there you can see all the packing there. And we think this is where the Rhynie man actually stood. And both of these stones were standing at the entranceway into this settlement in the Pictish period. So this is what we think the site would have looked like in our Blue Peter moment, with the buildings inside and the standing stones at the entranceway. And then a later phase, this enclosed by a big, elaborate timber wall. And then down by the village, we found a contemporary cemetery. So in 1994, another series of aerial photographs down the bottom left there. You can see these big square enclosures. And this is where some of the other Pictish stones have been found in the 19th century. And here we found the actual graves of Picts, including a preserved kiss burial with a Pictish woman who was buried here in the late 5th or early 6th century. And she was brought up locally, we think. So this is work by Professor Kate Britton, looking at the isotopes of this individual, showing that they grew up locally and they ate a terrestrial, plant-based and agricultural-based diet. And then through the wonders of radiocarbon dating, we were able to pin down the chronology of this site and show that this site emerged in the 4th century, so in the Roman period when the Picts are first mentioned, and it went on into the post-Roman period to around about the middle of the 6th century. And that is quite an interesting date, because that seems to be when the northern Picts begin to convert to Christianity. So this seems to be a kind of pagan power center that goes out of use in that mid-6th century. So we were quite pleased with the results, and I'll show you the material culture later, which explains why we think this was a high-status site. But in the background of that earlier picture of the crossdame, you could see Tappa Noth, and this is the second largest hill fort known as in northern Britain. And it's enclosed by this lower wall you can maybe just make out in the heather kind of mid-slope there. And on top is a much earlier fort dating to the Iron Age. And we did various kind of laser scanning of this hill, and you can see all the kind of pock marks on the left-hand side there. It looks like the surface of the moon, essentially. And those are all platforms that have been dug into the hill slopes for roundhouses or structures of some kind to be built on the slopes of that hill. And we think there was as many as 800 houses on that hill, which is just a really quite staggering amount. So again, if you think about, we had literally a handful of Pictish houses known in lowland Scotland, and then overnight we discovered this site with 800. It shows you just how transformative some of these excavations can be. And we established that this was enclosed by this lower stone wall, which is about 4 meters wide, and it was 1.5 kilometers in circumference, enclosing all the houses inside. So just think of the labor going into building that alone. And we've now dug about 20 of these houses on the slope there, and they all show really developed floor layers. These are not just kind of stances for tents. These are clearly kind of permanent or semi-permanent dwellings. And on the house floors, we found things like Roman pottery. We found metalworking evidence showing that this site was really intensely occupied. And this gives you an idea of the kind of extreme archaeology we had to undertake to excavate these sites. So these are 2 of the house platforms under excavation near the summit of the hill here. And here you can see some of the hearths. We've got multiple hearths, fireplaces, built one on top of another on these house platforms, again showing really quite intensive occupation. And then on the house floors, with things like Roman pottery coming from southern England, and even more exotic material, which I'll come back to in a minute. But essentially what this looks like is a giant settlement dating from the late Roman period through into the Pictish period proper, into the 5th, 6th, and early 7th centuries. So here we can again rely on radiocarbon dating, which shows that this site, Noth, emerged sometime in the late 3rd century. So again, round about when the Picts are first mentioned in the late 3rd century, Noth is just really kicking off as this major settlement. And then we also found a third site in this landscape at Caer Mor, which is on the south side of the valley. And this didn't have quite such spectacular material culture, but must have been a significant site as well, with hundreds of big oak timbers felled to create the enclosures of this settlement here. And again, this dating to the 4th or early 5th century through to the 6th or early 7th century. So essentially we've gone from a site where we only knew a series of carved stone monuments to realizing this was one of the most significant Pictish sites and early medieval sites we know from the whole of Britain and Ireland. So we've got this multifunctional, multi-nodal center of power in this landscape at Rhynie. And really, we have nothing like this elsewhere in early medieval Scotland. So the evidence is really, really quite exceptional. So going from really slim pickings in terms of Pictish archaeology to something that's quite, groundbreaking in terms of our knowledge of this time period, and really suggests, a scale of society that we hadn't really quite got into grips with in terms of these so-called Dark Age societies. And in terms of our radiocarbon dating is getting so good these days that we can tie it down to decades or generations, and we can actually see the kind of cycle, the sequence that happened here. And Noth seems to be the kind of foundational site in this landscape. So this huge settlement emerging in that late 3rd century, giving rise to this kind of royal centre down the lowland landscapes in the 4th century. And then the site at Caer Mor being added on later on as an extra level of complexity to this landscape. And I think if we're looking at the origins of this major centre, then I think the 3rd century is really, really interesting in terms of it's only a couple of generations after the last major campaigns by the Romans north of the Firth of Forth. So within a couple of generations of the Romans essentially abandoning this part of northern Britain, you have these big power centres emerging at a remove from the Roman Empire, who withdraw back to the Hadrian's Wall. And it's in the 4th century, during when we know there was repeated campaigns by the Picts against Roman Britain, including a major event called the Barbarian Conspiracy, when the Picts collude with the Saxons and the Scots and other groups to raid Roman Britain, that the cross-staying complex itself actually emerges. And I'm sure, again, that's not coincidence. This seems to be about the centralization of what became, or what we know of as Pictish society. So this is a really important step, I think. And we begin to see the kind of more obvious aspects of rulership and cult and ritual in terms of figures like the Rhynie man, who may well have been a pagan god of the Picts. So that's the kind of sequence. And I want to kind of show you why we think this was such a high status site. And that comes down to the finds that we got from the excavations. Now, as archaeologists, what we find is all the stuff that people have thrown away, okay? So remember that when you see some of the pictures. So we're like rifling through your bins to find out what kind of society you live in. So remember that when you're throwing stuff in your wheelie bins. But what they left behind is revealing and really tells an amazing story of the connections of the Picts who lived at this early royal centre of Pictland. So this is research conducted by lots of individuals, but the kind of main coordinator of this is Gemma Cruikshanks, who works at the National Museum of Scotland. And you can see that there's a whole variety of different finds of different types, most of them coming from the Crossdane complex at Rhynie, but very similar things also from Noth and from Cairmore too. One of the big categories of evidence is evidence for production. And so this is one of the sources of wealth and influence of this community. So in Germanic context, kings were known as the giver of rings or the breakers of treasure. Okay, so this is how they're garnering influence. This is how they're gaining wealth within society. And this was a pre-coin using economy. So things like metalwork, brooches, etc. were really important. So again, what we find is the kind of production evidence and the stuff that you threw away. So we've got hundreds of these little ceramic vessels in which there are melting down precious metals to make objects. So there's hundreds of these, and we only dug, say about 10% of the site. Most of this was using bronze or copper alloys, but there is also evidence for silver working as well. And most amazingly, we got these little stone vessels, and they had these really dramatic kind of residues. Hard to appreciate from the picture on the right there, but these really bright reds and blues on this vessel. And we got this analysed, and it's actually from lead and silver waste. They're actually refining silver at Rhynie to make a better source in order to create the fancy silver objects they must have been producing here. And this is the first evidence for the refining of silver that we have from early medieval Scotland. And it's exceptionally rare across Britain and Ireland, really. So they're refining their own metals, and it shows the kind of skills of the metal workers here at Rhynie. And then again, we've got the molds for making all the fancy objects. We don't have too many fancy objects because they recycled them or they traded them, etc. But we've got whole groups of different metalworking molds for making high-status objects. So that includes things like hand pins. These are beautiful silver or bronze pins that people use for fastening their cloak or for hairpins. And these are exceptionally rare across Britain and Ireland. Only a handful of these known. But we now have 50% of all the production evidence for this object in Scotland comes from this single site at Rhynie. And what's amazing is that none of these pins or objects are the same as one another. This is bespoke production for giving out to your followers. And we know from things like Irish law tracts that things like brooches and handpins were literally the symbols of kings and lords. This is kind of stuff that was only found within the elite of society. And we occasionally see on Pictish stones, you see high-status individuals wearing these amazing penannular brooches, and we've got the evidence of the production of these at Rhynie. So these are molds for making the barrel-shaped pins that supported these penannular brooches. Essentially, you fasten your cloak by using these brooches. And again, this is exceptionally rare evidence for production of these large brooches that we only tend to find in hoards rather than on settlement sites. But probably the most amazing series of molds are for making tiny little animal figurines that resemble what you see on the Pictish stones. So again, this is one of the amazing things about Rhynie, is that we're finding objects in the ground that resemble what you see on the famous stones. And it helps us date the stones, helps us understand the kind of iconography behind that. So there's 16 different molds for making different animal figurines. But they're all wild animals, and they're animals of the hunt. So here we've got a little mold for making a wild boar. So you can see the crest of the figure there. And again, this is the kind of animals we see on Pictish stones. So this is from a stone up near Inverness from Doors, this wild boar. So we're making little silver or bronze versions of these animals. And this is another one. It's a tiny hound or wolf. As you can maybe just make out his snout on the left-hand side and his tail on the right there. And then that's our drawing by reconstruction artists of what it looks like. And again, there's Pictish stones with very similar animals shown on the stones. So this is from New Bigging, Leslie, just a few miles away from Rhynie. And then this was the most remarkable one recently. It was Gemma Cruikshanks from the National Museum identified this as a bear or a badger, and we have a big debate about which. So maybe we can have a show of hands at the end of the talk about whether it's a bear or a badger. I prefer bear because it's a bit more majestic, but maybe badger, who knows. But again, we find bears depicted on Pictish stones. So it's, again, remarkable to find these objects in the ground. So what were they for, these little animal figurines? Well, we've gone through lots of different possibilities. You do occasionally find them on things like helmets for warriors. So this is an example, an Anglo-Saxon example of a wild boar made of iron, in this case, on the remains of a helmet of a warrior from Anglo-Saxon England. But our ones don't have any obvious attachments to actually attach them to anything. That could have been added later, but it could be that they are for a different purpose. So they could be amulets of the hunt. So this imagery of the hunt becomes incredibly important on Pictish stones. In the later Pictish period, we see, again, elites chasing wild boar or deer, etc. And near to Rhynie is the Cabrac, which was a royal forest in the later time period. So again, it could tell you something about the kind of activities that people were undertaking in the Rhynie landscape. And what we did a few years back is we 3D scanned the molds. So these are two-piece clay molds. So we were able to scan them and reverse that scan. And then we got an artist from Edinburgh College of Art to cast these in silver. And you can see the beautiful little boar figurines we were able to get from that. And it could be that there are a whole range of different purposes. There could be gaming pieces as well. So we've got other evidence for other crafts as well. We've got these tiny, tiny little glass rods. Amazing that one of our student excavators managed to spot these. And these might be for bead making, so making little trails, or for making the kind of enamel inlay that you see on some of the fancy silver objects we get from the Pictish period. And then there's things like spindle whorls for spinning yarn. And then occasionally, we also found the kind of fancier objects that people had dropped or misplaced on site. So there's this amazing object on the left here, which is a little iron pin, maybe about 6 inches high, and it's got this spiral on one side, and it looks like a miniature axe, just like the Rhynie man carries. So again, it's amazing to find these objects in the ground that illuminate what you see on the stones themselves. And then there's some copper alloy cloak fasteners there on the right. But then also the actual tools that they were using to create some of the fancy metalwork here. So we found this metalworking tongs, and there's only a couple of sets from the whole of Britain and Ireland. And these were for lifting the crucibles, for pouring the metal into the molds. And we can actually see some of the tong marks still on the crucibles themselves. So we're able to match some of the tools to the actual processes of metalworking. And then this came out the ground here on the top right here, and it's an iron blade, and it looked really unimpressive when we first got it out the ground. But this X-ray showed that these kind of zigzag marks on the blade, and this is actually from pattern welding, where you get lots of different bars of iron, and you fold them into one another, and it's like the highest level of bladesmith you can get from this time period. And again, this is the first example of pattern welding we have from early medieval Scotland. So you've got some of the most skilled blacksmiths around operating out of Rhynie in the 5th and 6th centuries. And this kind of object is found in Anglo-Saxon graves, where they tended to bury people with their finery. And again, they're only found in the high status Anglo-Saxon burials, usually associated with the warriors or a warrior identity. And we also have the top of a sword. So we have no confirmed Pictish swords, but we've got bits and pieces showing they were wielding such weapons. So this is a little copper alloy pommel from a sword from Rhynie. And then another kind of slightly mysterious object when it first came out. This was a tiny bit of metal, about the size of a 50p piece. And you could just see there's little engravings on it. I don't know if you can make that out. Anyway, this is our reconstruction. And it's actually a face of a Pict, perhaps. So this must have been a larger object. And it's got little holes for suspension, so it might have been something that was on a shield or the like. And I can't emphasize how rare depictions of the human form are in the whole of kind of prehistoric Scotland. It's only when we get to the Pictish period that people start to draw or sculpt or cast in copper alloy the human form. So this is a really interesting moment in the history of what became Scotland, when people began to depict the human form. Again, perhaps influenced by the Mediterranean cultures, the Roman Empire to the south. And then we've got the exotics, stuff that was coming from further afield. So at Noth in the early phases, this includes Roman pottery. So Rhynie was a couple of 100 kilometers north of the frontier in the 4th century, but it was getting material from Roman Britain. Things like this Nene Valley ware, which was coming from southern Roman pottery production sites. So why is that material getting its way to Rhynie? Is this through raiding or trading, or is it directed bribes from the Roman world to try and pacify these people living north of the frontier? But then the most exceptional material is this stuff. And again, it doesn't look like much, because this is the stuff that they've thrown away after a boozy night, probably. Because this is late Roman amphora, they're known as. And these are coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, so it's from the Eastern Roman Empire, and made its way to Rhynie in the late 5th or early 6th century. It's usually for storing wine or oil. I suspect the Picts were more interested in the wine. So people were drinking Mediterranean wine at Rhynie in the 5th or early 6th century, including at Noth. We found this material right near the summit of that hill fort. So you can imagine 550 meters up, they're quaffing this wine from the Mediterranean. And they were drinking that wine out of vessels that came from Western France. Beautiful wine goblets, cone-shaped beakers. So you can't actually put them down. You have to pass them round. And it's all about the wine feast. It's about entertaining your fancy followers. And again, this stuff is exceptionally rare in early medieval Britain and Ireland. It's only found at the top tier of sites, the royal centres. So we've got glass coming from Western France, glass coming from Anglo-Saxon England, showing the kind of remarkable contacts that these people had. But then we've also got kind of more mundane stuff. But even this is amazing. So we had no idea the Picts were making their own pottery in northeast Scotland until the excavations at Rhynie. So now we've got dozens of locally made vessels identified from this site and from Noth. They were grinding grain. This was the daily grind, literally. And there's these tiny little stone discs that are about this size. And they are thought to be little pallets for either chopping up little herbs or for mixing makeup for wearing. So again, it's just remarkable. And then little polished pebbles, and these are from gaming pieces. And so they're the first time that people played board games in northern Britain is during the Roman period. So again, they're inheriting the idea of board games from these Mediterranean civilizations. So all in all, it's just quite a remarkable assemblage, and there's no other site in Scotland with this range of material. And so the only kind of real comparisons are some of the sites that we know from Ireland. And Ireland has a much better documentary record from this time period. There's legal tracts, etc. And so a very close comparison is this site down in southwest Ireland called Garans. And this was a documented royal site of one of the major lineages of early Ireland. And it's got a very similar assemblage to Rhynie. So it suggests this is what the status of the site at Rhynie was composed of. Now, I'm kind of running out of time, but it's important to say that we weren't just doing archaeology in this landscape. What we were also doing was making some great friends, communicating our research in ways that I would never have envisioned. And this was through the work of the local group called Rhynie Women, Debbie and Daisy, local artists, who created this creative group who worked alongside with us. They raised their own money in terms of Creative Scotland grants and Heritage Lottery grants. And we did all sorts of things. We had pop-up museums, we had fire festivals. If you look very closely, you can see me dressed as a Pict there, but no one really wants to see that close up, I don't think. We had pop-up museums. It was a really amazing example of how communities and academics and archaeologists can work together to communicate important knowledge about the past. So really, just to sum all that up, what have we got at Rhynie? Well, we don't have any documented Pictish kings prior to the late 6th century, but that's probably just because of the lack of sources. So we can certainly see in the Roman period, we have lots of references to some sort of consolidation, centralization of society north of the frontier. And I think that's what we're finding evidence of at Noth, this huge settlement emerging in that late Roman period. And it's really what really defines the Dark Ages and early medieval society is this idea of a warrior kingdom. And that seems to be something that's probably happening, distilling, being created at the northern frontier, perhaps earlier than anywhere else. So if you think about this, this would have been a kind of military zone at the edges of this Roman civilization. And here, the importance of warrior leadership would have been really, really quite central. So I think this idea of kind of authority backed by the point of a sword, as someone has described this, seems to be in evidence at Rhynie through things like the weaponry we're finding, the iconography you find on the stones. And so we have clear evidence, I think, for the centralization of society and this emerging royal center from at least the 4th century at Rhynie, well before we have these documented kings in the 6th century. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. You might have seen some postcards lying around where you can buy some merch to support the project. And we also have a book out, which I was going to bring along copies to try and flog, but our publisher told me last week that it's actually currently out of print because they're waiting to print a new version, so I was completely scuppered. But anyway, please follow us on social media, and thank you very, very much for listening.